Okay, guys, so we're back for part 4 of the respiratory system. So in the last video, we looked at how does breathing work, and we examined the concept of pressure gradients, of how volume pressure really determine the ability for us to inhale and exhale. So usually gas is moving from a high pressure gradient to a low pressure gradient, and that is the reason that we can inhale and exhale air is because the lung volume shifts in relative to the the lung pressure shifts relative to the atmospheric pressure, which allows either the air to come in on an inhale or out on an exhale. And then the other thing we looked at is really this sort of um, nervous system or autonomic control of the breath. So we started to take all the pieces that we've been talking about and put it together. And that we know that the brainstem at the medulla oblongata is the respiratory center, and then that receives signals for us to be able to um, inhale or exhale. So it receives information. It says, okay, there's too much carbon dioxide, our pH is getting unbalanced. We need you to go ahead and inhale and take in the oxygen with the air. We do that because we have that pressure gradient. The air comes in. So the nerves get triggered, the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves get triggered. We have contraction, which creates the volume expansion, the pressure decrease, the air comes in. We get the exchange, like we've talked about in the couple videos ago, between the oxygen and the carbon dioxide at the alveolar sacs where the capillaries are. So we get that exchange. And then as that lungs reach their maximum expansion, the stretch receptors say, okay, you're stretched enough. I need you to go ahead and exhale now. So it sends a nerve, the stretch receptors send through a signal through the vagus nerve, which goes back to the respiratory center that says, okay, time to exhale. So relaxes the musculature of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm start to relax. The volume of the lungs gets smaller, the pressure goes up. The air on the outside now has a lower pressure gradient, so the air flows from the lungs out. Cool. All right, so in this video, we're going to look at, just quickly dip into something that I'm calling breathing pattern disorders. And I think this is important because a lot of times we'll see a couple of these in our students, and we can, you know, create some opportunity to create more awareness of the body and some options to, be more conscientious about their breath pattern and their breathing pattern, and maybe try to optimize it a little bit. So I'm gonna share a screen again, and this is all going to be in the notes. So we know that a normal breathing pattern is classified as what we would call diaphragmatic or abdominal breathing. So that's normal. We want the belly to move out on an inhale. We want the belly to relax in on an exhale. So remember we said this expansion in the lung cavity, so we increase the volume and the diaphragm pushes down, actually decreases the amount of space in the belly, and so it pushes the belly out. So this is normal on a normal inhale, and this is normal in a normal exhale as that diaphragm goes back up, right? It creates more room in the abdominal cavity, so the belly relaxes in and the cavity of the lungs gets smaller. Well, that would be ideal, but this isn't always ideal. Like, this isn't always happening for people. So sometimes you may hear, in the world of yoga, you may hear this concept of paradoxical breathing. And that's what I want to kind of visit, as well as a couple of other things. So you can have a dysfunction in your breathing pattern, and there's a lot of different dysfunctions that can happen, and they can happen for a number of different reasons. So there could be a biochemical reason, there could be a biomechanical reason, there could be a psychological reason, and there could just be some unknown factors. When you hear paradoxical breathing, this is what we usually are referring to when the abdomen draws in on the inhalation and out on the exhalation. So it's completely opposite. So imagine this says inhale here, and the belly's going in on an inhale. And imagine this as exhale, and the belly's going out on an exhale. Completely opposite of what is really supposed to be happening as the lung uh, cavity expands on an inhalation and exhalation. It tends to be one of the more severe breathing pattern disorders, and a lot of times it actually happens as a result of a physical injury that people have in the chest cavity with broken ribs, called flail chest sometimes. But you can see this in our students, and you probably will see this. Now, it's nothing that you would immediately go and address when you're in a class with someone, because it oftentimes this is a long-standing thing that people have developed, and they're not even totally clear about how to sort of reverse that for them. And I do want to just talk about a couple of other breathing pattern disorders. The other one that we see a lot of is chest breathing. So they really breathe more into the chest, the sternum, and the shoulder girdles, right? And there will be minimal movement of the belly. So the breathing occurs really up here in the chest. And remember, we talked about in one of our previous videos about those accessory muscles, the secondary muscles of respiration, the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes. This is where you can really see when someone's chest breathing, you can actually see those muscles working pretty extensively to continue to move the breath in the chest. Like they don't have a lot of movement in the diaphragm to allow that belly to create movement, right, with the expansion and the retraction of the belly. The other kind of breathing pattern disorder, this one is not that big of a deal. There's something called the startle response breath. You can read that if you want. And then there's some other interesting variations and dysfunction of abdominal breathing. So really when we talk about abdominal breathing, we're actually having really expansion. You can see here, really forwards, backwards, and laterally. So it's sort of this full width of expansion, and not only in the belly, but because the lungs are expanding, right? The chest expands as well. So you hear that chest expands, find the rib expansion. And sometimes people will really have only limited motion. They'll be asymmetrical, like you'll see one side of the belly moving or the other. The same thing may happen with the rib cage. You may kind of see them be more mobile in one side of the rib cage or the other. They may only have forward movement of the belly. They really won't have this lateral or posterior movement of the belly. Same thing with the ribs. Sometimes you can only see the front part of the chest moving. Sometimes, and you can't really see the sides or the backs of the ribs moving as easily as the rest of the ribs. And then sometimes, you have the lateral involvement as well as a anterior involvement, but not so much the posterior. So just something to be aware of, because you will start to kind of see these things in people. And as you move through your training, one of the things really that you'll learn kind of in a 300-hour and beyond are some of the tools and tricks that we have to really help people realign their breathing pattern so it is more optimal, so that they're creating this pattern of breath, inhale, belly out, exhale, belly in. Okay. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to now take everything that we had and we really want to tie this together, right? Like let's tie it up together. So we've been tying it together all the way through with yoga, but let's do some more tying together. And I think one of the best places for us to really tie this together is this concept of when, as we age, there is a natural tendency for our lung functions to gradually decline, which ultimately could make breathing more difficult. So we really do want to maintain maximum lung function for the duration of our life. And if possible, we'd really like to help strengthen it, which helps us to maintain overall health. So now I have this graph, and let's be honest, this is not anything you've got to know or memorize or look at, but I just kind of want to give you a little like tidbit here of like, okay, how can we how can we build our lung function? How can we make our lungs, really work as most advantageously as we can? And one of the things that they've studied over the years are these different pieces of our breathing pattern, right? So you see all this different stuff that relates to inspiratory and expiratory and whatnot, um, and reserve capacity and volume and things like that. Now, these are called lung functions, and you can get these tested. And oftentimes, if you have a disease of the lungs, they'll test this and there'll be markers for you. But one of those lung functions is total lung capacity, or TLC, which refers to the maximum amount of air that your lungs can hold. And on average, we can hold about 6 liters on average. Now, one of the interesting things is that come out is that this concept, the lung capacity, the amount of air you can hold in your lungs, actually predicts health and longevity. And that this 29-year study that they did in a journal called Chest, you can look if you want, I have the link attached here, concluded that the pulmonary function is a long-term predictor for all cause and cause-specific mortality in both genders. And I would argue that at this point it would be any gender really, so those across the spectrum of gender fluidity. And that means that this is absolutely vital. So the better you can, the more air you're able to take in and an inhale, which means the more air you're able to exhale, not always necessarily, but technically you could exhale that air out as long as you don't have some sort of disease state or dysfunction of the lungs. That ability of your ability to be able to take in air is along the higher you can get that, the bigger it is, the better of a predictor it is for long term over all causes. That all cause means anything, all the causes of death. Doesn't matter. If you have good lung capacity, you tend to live longer. And so the interesting thing is actually many of us do not use our full lung capacity. Some of the people that have the best lung capacity, free divers. They really do know how to use and maximize their lung capacity. But that's the thing, we can utilize yoga and our practice of pranayama inside of the yoga to really increase our lungs function. So how do you keep your lungs healthy, right? So what are the couple of things that we need to be doing? Well, one, this is pretty well established. We should avoid smoking tobacco products, really, of any kind. That will keep the things that are toxic and unable to be processed out of the lung tissue and keep the lungs healthy. Another thing is actually avoiding pollution. I don't have it on there. Air pollution is another one that they're finding is a really poor predictor of health. So when you live in areas that have a higher air pollution, lower air quality, you tend to have difficulty with lungs. The other thing, consistently hydrating properly. You need the lungs, all the viscera in the body, most of the body is made up of water. So the better hydrated you are, the healthier your lung tissue can be. And we really want to make sure we stay active. So we want to engage in activities where we get some cardiovascular engagement, as well as we want to maintain or improve upon and or maintain our healthy posture, right? So these two things, we can get both of these things, cardiovascular engagement as well as healthy posture in through our yoga asana. And then the last one is our pranayama. So when we talk specifically about asana, right, here's are the one of the things that we want to hone in on is the concept of improving and maintaining our good posture. So for a couple of reasons, right? So you heard me talk about in the breath pattern dysfunction or disorders, the concept of the ribs and the movement of the ribs and the movement of the belly, right? So we want to, if we can ensure all directions of spinal movement are incorporated into our yoga asana practice. So if we move forwards, we move backwards, we go to the side, we twist, and we have that axial extension, that helps us to maintain spinal mobility, which improves that spinal mobility, improves our overall posture, right? So if we have good movement and we're and we're fluid in our movement, and we're increasing the muscular strength, right? Especially in those postural muscles through the back side of the body. It improves our overall posture, and it assists with the thoracic cavity and the elasticity of the intercostal muscles, right? And then that combined together can actually help create more space for the lungs to be able to move and expand in all of the directions of the thoracic cavity, right? It's 360 degrees of the thoracic cavity. And those, you saw the intercostal muscles wrap all the way around, and you have the ribs coming down, they articulate with the spine. So if we can keep ourselves in really nice posture, good alignment, that gives us maximum ability to utilize the chest cavity as best as possible versus, slouching over, finding that round in the spine, hunching our shoulders, generally this contracted sort of state. So one of the other things, when we're talking about that, in particular, back bends are really amazing for helping to prevent or improve upon what we call chest barreling and an increase in kyphosis. So they can keep us from this. So remember, kyphosis is that rounding, the spine starts to move in an opposite direction. So you kind of get that humpback, Dowers jump hump. And so we start to back bend, and we open up the front side of the body and help to keep that back posterior side of the thoracic cavity strong and open. The other thing here is working with our specific asanas for the development of our core strength and the opening of hips, right? So we want to have good core strength so that our core can work maximally as we breathe, right? So the belly is part of our breathing pattern, right? The belly moves in all the directions. And the other thing is this opening of the hips. So the opening of the hips correlates to breathing posture when we move into our pranayama. Usually you're seated for your pranayama. So if you can start to move through the lower body, open up the hips and get the legs so that you can be seated, then you can deepen into the pranayama practice, which has additional positive impacts on lung function. Yeah, we kind of cover all that. So that's, so with asana, we're looking at, healthy fluid movement, good posture, and a nice open posture through the hips. And then when we come specifically to talk now about the practice of pranayama and how it can help us with our lung function, we want to look at a couple different things here. So the first thing is this concept of being able to create more fluidity within our lungs. So we didn't really cover this earlier, so I'm going to cover it here, although it is in your notes earlier. There's this concept of compliance and elasticity. So lung compliance and lung elasticity. And really for us, these are two really big concepts when it comes to the concept of pranayama. So really, truly, proper lung function, and this will make sense because we've talked about this a lot without saying it, but proper lung function depends on the balance between the lungs' ability to stretch out, right? So the inhale, it really depends on the ability of it to expand, which is the compliance of the lungs, and the ability of it to recoil, right? On exhalation, the ability of it to recoil, which is considered as the elasticity. So compliance and elasticity. So those two have to be balanced. If your lungs lose compliance, so if they become a little harder or stiffer, they aren't able to stretch out as much, right? So if they can't open up and stretch out as much, you can't have as big a change in volume and as big a change in pressure so that you can take in a big breath of air. So taking in air will become difficult, right? So, and again, this happens when we have this, when we have things like pulmonary fibrosis, or a stiffening of the lungs, anything that would cause like a stiffening of the lungs. And then elasticity is if your lungs lose the ability to recoil, so they can't come in, you can't exhale as well, right? So you'll start to have difficulty exhaling, actually getting the air out, getting the carbon dioxide out. You won't actually be able to push it out as effectively. And both of those can cause a lot of concerns and problems and can reduce your lung function, right? So, and the disease state that is most typically associated with this sort of inability to recoil, some of you may have heard it's called emphysema. So, to keep a balance of the compliance and the elasticity, we need to exercise both of those, right? So we need to be doing them. We need to build up our compliance and build up our elasticity. We need to be able to broaden the lungs, and we need to be able to let the lungs recoil. So we can support compliance by inhaling fully, finding that expansion through the rib cage and retaining the air in. And then we can support lung elasticity by exhaling fully and holding the air out. Does this sound familiar at all? Right? So when we are in our pranayama practice, that's what we're doing, right? So we're creating this inhalation. We inhale, expand the lungs. We retain, and then we exhale, retract the lungs. And sometimes we will or won't retain on the end of the exhale, right? You keep the air out and then you inhale. So when you're breathing, you're working your lungs and the musculature around the lungs, right? The muscles is what really actually moves the lung. And then because you're creating better movement, you're allowing compliance and elasticity to be improved and at most optimal function, which allows you to have really good lung capacity, which is a predictor of overall long-term. So we can, in our pranayamas, right, we can increase our breath threshold. So we can consistently work on deepening our inhalations and the lengthening our exhalations, which correlates directly to compliance and elasticity. And we can do this not only in pranayama practice, right, but also in asana. You will hear your teachers and instructors cue you sometimes to take in and inhale, and they'll give you counts, and take out and exhale. You can let the breath flow with the movement. And as you flow through class, you can consciously control the movement of the breath in and out, right? And then you can also work with the breath retention on both ends. So you can hold the breath in, or you can hold the breath out. And then you can work proportionally on all four of those, right? So on the inhale retention, on the exhale, and on the exhale retention. And now, did any of you recall what the names are for each of those four parts? Again, my pronunciation of Sanskrit's not so great, but the inhale starts with a P, Haraka. Retention of the breath in, Antara Kumbhaka, Kumbhaka. Exhalation, Rachara. Richaka, I think it's Richaka. And then retention of breath out is also a Kumbhaka, but it's a Baya Kumbhaka, right? And again, I apologize for my Sanskrit. I'm working on it. So working those parts works the compliance and the elasticity, which can improve lung capacity and overall health. There we go. So pretty cool. And then the next thing, and the last thing we really want to look at is like, okay, so that was for personal, like this isn't a personal practice. It's also for your students, but like really now let's take this and say, why does this matter as a yoga instructor? Like, what can we do as a yoga instructor to really um, assist and optimize our students' experience with yoga? So we'll drop down in our notes again. So again, breathing is one of the biggest tools that we utilize in class, right? And we want to develop awareness around, you want to start to develop awareness around how you students breathe or don't breathe when you're in class, so that you can help to, I'm going to actually stop sharing for a minute, so that you can help to um, modulate the class, so that you can encourage good breath, good movement of air, and simultaneously, as we know, get our nervous system integrated, right? Because those exhalations, that vagus nerve really turns on and likes it. So there's a couple of things you kind of want to be aware of. So the first one I like to always talk about is the concept of just breath awareness. So if you can utilize breath awareness, and usually a good time to do breath awareness is the beginning of class and even at the end of class. So it's a really powerful practice, beyond just as almost equal as powerful as the actual changing of the breath, right? To change the breath. So just becoming aware of the breath. So there have been studies that have shown that just being aware of the breath can actually trigger them to slow down and deepen their respiration cycles, which when it slows down and deepens, they may get that long exhale, gets that vagus nerve really online, really working. So we can, when we're in class, we can actually help to sort of make that happen. We can sort of help our students move from a more energetic, agitated state to a little bit more calm, parasympathetic state. It doesn't mean we want to like totally knock them out. We just want to have this, we want to get this balance between the two, right? So that they're not in this like hurry, 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 fight, flight kind of concepts. And maybe they're not totally all the way rested and relaxed, but they're just in this nice, even balance, right? The body likes balance between things. So as we talked about, and there's a nice diagram in your notes here about the inhale, hold, exhale, and how the exhale, the elongation of the exhale can really help turn on the vagus. But specifically, so how can you help to shift your students? What can you do to help shift your students' breathing, right? Like how can you bring this into a class environment and class setting? So when you are in a class, one of the things that you're going to start to notice and pick up on is what's happening in the class. Like how is the class breathing? What does it sound like? What's it going? So a couple of things you want to be aware of is lack of breathing. That's usually the first thing that you can notice when the room starts to become quiet and you can't hear them breathing anymore. It usually means they're tend to be in a more difficult posture or a longer hold, and people will often forget to breathe. They'll hold their breath. You can pick up on when people are having shallow breathing. They're not breathing as deeply. They're breathing a little bit more shallow, maybe a little bit more into the chest, or there's more rapid breathing. So those three things are really nice things to notice as you're going through class, because then you can start to shift your cues to bring people back into awareness of the breath, bring them back online with the breath, because we want them in class to be breathing as as smoothly as possible, right? We really want them to be in tune and aligned with the breath. And that's usually one of the harder things to do, because you get into the body and you kind of forget about the breath because you don't really have to worry about the breath. It happens automatically for you. So watching for those three things, right? So this lack of breathing, rapid breathing, shallow breathing. And when you start to pick up on those, you can sort of adjust your cueing to do that. So things to consider, right? When you're looking through this is like, particularly when you're in those movements, what's the pace of your class? Like how quickly are you making them go, or how slowly are you making go? Usually it's the quicker pace where you start to see this difficulty in breathing start to happen. So watch the pace of your class. Also, the tone and inflection of your voice. So if you're more hurried or you sound more agitated or you're more kind of direct and da 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 da, that sometimes can trigger a more rapid response in breath, right? Because it starts to bring people up a little bit. And if that's your purpose, great, no problem. But just be conscientious of tone and inflection, because tone and inflection, and I would say also tone inflection and then rhythm, the rhythm of how you're speaking can influence how someone is breathing. So watching those couple of things and using that to help to bring breath back online, or to slow it down a little bit, or to give it, time to like kind of catch up to what you're doing. And then also sometimes this the general setup of class. Like, can you set the class up to really be for them to be sort of honed in on and attuned to the breath from the get-go? Can you do a little breath awareness when they're in their, you're in the beginning of class and bring them into child's pose and you start to have become aware of the breath. You start to get them to pace the breath a little bit more. You bring in that ujjayi breathing. Can you get that the way you're setting the class up? And then as you're theming through the class too, it could be a theme that you work with during the class. And then the other thing is watching particular postures, right? So we talked about that a little bit with lack of breathing. So one of the things Amber talks about a lot is not cramming the breath into the posture. See, we need to have space in the posture to be able to breathe into the posture. So giving students cues to allow them to be in the posture in a way that allows them to breathe the posture. We want them to breathe in the posture. We really want them to be with the breath and be aware. Because ultimately, all of this stuff that's happening on the mat and in the room, especially with breath and their response through the nervous system, it starts to translate outside of the room and right off the mat outside of the room. These are things, these small shifts and changes that happen during your practice can be integrated into your life day to day and have really positive, beautiful effects on people's life and their lifestyle. So it's no small thing to really tune to and be aware of breath when you're in teaching a class. Now, it is a skill that will come as you teach. So you don't have to have this like overwhelming expectation of yourself to like be right on with the breath. Just know that as you work through your time as a teacher and as an instructor, and you get more familiar inside of teaching and being in a classroom and being in relationship with the bodies in the room and the energy in the room and the breath in the room, that you'll start to pick up on this, and that you can really be effective without even like they don't even know that maybe you have to be doing this sometimes, but they can really benefit from you being aware of what's happening with breath in class, right? And that they can have ease in their breath and ease in their practice when they are in the body and attuned to and aware of their own patterns of breathing. All right, you guys, so I think we've come to the end of the respiratory. It's a really long section. It's pretty in depth, but it's so, so, so important. So we talked a little bit about breathing pattern disorders, right? We talked a little bit about paradoxical breathing, belly in on an inhale, belly out on an exhale. That's that paradox. And then we also talked about connecting respiration with yoga. Really, that's all we spent this time on. We talked about lung capacity, how we can work to help build lung capacity, how we can keep our lungs healthy by making sure we're being, really working with our lung compliance and our lung elasticity, and how pranayama really helps us to do that, and how being aware of and bringing good posture, developing good posture or maintaining good posture, and then also having the movements of the spine, the ability to move the spine in the yoga asana. And then we talked a lot about, right now, just why does this matter as an instructor, and what can you do to help bring this to your students as an instructor. So that's it. we're wrapping up respiratory here, and we'll head on into the nervous system, as well as endocrine, digestive, and lymphatic. So I'll see you on the other side.